Our next presenter is Dr. Wong-Rieger, who is the president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. She has a long history of advocacy for various diseases, including anemia and hemophilia. She holds a PhD in psychology, and she'll be reviewing for us Canada's rare disease drug strategy. Dr. Wong-Rieger.
Hello, I'm Durhane Wong-Rieger, the President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, and I'm so very pleased to be invited to speak to you. I want to talk to you about Canada's rare drug strategy, the newly proposed drug strategy that is hopefully going to be coming into place in 2022. And what we say is that it's a drug strategy that is, in fact, for all Canadians. Just going to walk you through it briefly. So, why is it that we say we need a new approach to treating rare diseases? And certainly, as we know, scleroderma is one of the really underserved, under-recognized rare diseases. Well, in a recent survey that CORD, the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, did, here's what we learned. And this is an update to a survey that we did about 5 years ago. 87% of the people who responded said that they had a delayed, a wrong, or no diagnosis for their rare condition. 84% said that they had experienced delay or no access to a rare disease specialist or clinic. 86% said that they had experienced delayed or denied coverage for prescription medicines. And in many respects, this is true regardless of whether they had a public plan or a private drug plan. So the private drug plans as well, very problematic for our rare disease patient. And 84% said that they had experienced some delay or been denied coverage for their support services. So really definitely clear that we need to have a different approach to treating rare diseases. So what do we have going for us is that we have, in fact, the opportunity to have a new drug strategy. And so just to say that, in 2019, the Canadian government in their budget announced that they would be allocating $1 billion over 2 years to actually set up a new rare disease drug strategy that would be implemented in 2022, 2023, and that there would be a guaranteed allocation of $500 million per year. So this was, in fact, one of the first big pieces of news that really spoke to us that, yes, the government was going to get serious in trying to treat patients with rare diseases. Now, obviously, we're still a long ways from actually having a rare disease strategy. CORD has been hosting a series of consultations on what this drug strategy ought to look like. And beginning in January of this year, we've had Health Canada doing consultations to really speak with healthcare practitioners, with researchers, with the system providers, and certainly with patients as well. What do we need to have in this rare disease system? So what we're really trying to do is to engage more stakeholders from all sectors, from research, clinicians, patients, certainly from the industry as well, to come together and really talk about what we think this rare disease drug strategy ought to look like. So what do we hope this drug strategy will do? Well, as we say, we hope it will rescue those lives on a knife edge due to denied or delayed drug access. Really, for patients where there is a critical need and where there is a therapy and where that therapy is to treat a progressive or life-threatening disease, if patients don't get access right away, they're not going to be able to benefit from it. What we want this system drug strategy to do, though, is not just talk about drugs, but talk about a rare disease system, because we know that we don't do drugs in a vacuum. We need to be able to have what we call the 3GD system. We've got to have the precision diagnosis so that we get a good exact diagnosis, that we are able to have experts that are going to be doing the care and actually administering the treatment. And we need to have follow-up, what we would anticipate real-world data monitoring. So what we're looking for is not just a drug, but a program of care. We want to have evidence-informed access to that's going to be updated by continuous data collection and analysis. Many of these therapies are going to be coming in oftentimes without long clinical trials, and obviously in many of the cases for communities that might be quite varied. So we don't know how it's going to work from one subsector of that community to another. And we want to make sure that we are developing along the way those best practice guidelines so that we can integrate drug therapy into the other care, into support, and into research. We also recognize that we want to have individualized patient-centered access pathways, that Not every drug is the same in terms of coming in for rare diseases. Certainly not every disease is the same. Not every jurisdiction is the same. So in order for patients to be able to get access, we're going to have to consider multiple pathways, not just the single pathway that we're talking about now that we have, where it comes through the federal government, goes through a review process, goes through a pricing, and then there to the provinces to decide whether or not they're going to have it. We need to be able to anticipate that these drugs are going to be quite varied, and the populations they're serving are equally varied. So who is this drug strategy for? Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples here. These are our spinal muscular atrophy twins. They were misdiagnosed from the very beginning, very delayed diagnosis. They were almost 2 years old before they got a diagnosis. So even though we have a treatment that's approved in Canada, they didn't get it until they were almost 2 years old, by which time they developed significant symptomatology. And in fact, they're trying to get access to the gene therapy, and the sense is that they may actually already have become too old to qualify for this therapy. So getting timely diagnosis is the first step, and also then getting timely access to medicine. Here I've got a representation for one of our lovely young teens who has a congenital retinal disease, and it's causing him to lose gradually almost all of his eyesight. He's a brilliant classical pianist. He's a Taekwondo specialist, but he's going to face permanent loss of his eyesight unless he can get access to a gene therapy that's approved in Canada, already been recommended by the Health Technology Assessment, but they haven't actually agreed on what the pricing of this will be. And he's got left maybe about a 4-month window in which he could still get therapy before all of the cones in his eyes are going to be non-functional, and he's not going to be able to benefit from the therapy. So again, timely access, but also being able to make sure that it's done appropriately. We want to make sure we have therapies that are going to be preventive and risk reductions. I use here just as an example, a host of rare blood disorders where there are now therapies that can actually reduce the need for plasma transfusions, for blood transfusions, reduce the risk in terms of having a crisis, an episode. And the challenge is getting the system to actually value preventive therapies. And because these benefits are going to be only recognized over a long period of time, making accessible these therapies, even though we don't have the full long-term data yet. We'll have to accumulate that over many years. We also want to make sure that for those progressive diseases, where in fact the diseases will become more problematic as children or adults get older, that we're able to provide the treatment as soon as possible. In many cases, especially for pediatric conditions, we will have a notice of compliance. We will have indications for children. And even though we get an approved indication for adults, the system is slow to make it available because we don't have really good clinical trial evidence on adults, and will oftentimes delay for 2 to 4 years until more trials are done. And by that time, the disease again has progressed. By that time, the patients are less likely to actually be able to fully respond. When we're talking about emerging therapies, this is very exciting for us. For some of these conditions for which there is no therapy, fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva is one of those diseases which is, truly, devastating. A second skeleton grows over the original skeleton, and over time, patients, of course, lose their mobility. This is Marion, one of our great patient advocates who died late last year. She was in the clinical trial, one of the patients who really showed a response to the therapy, but unfortunately died from complications, not from the therapy, but from her own condition. Below, some of you may recognize Johnson Petrie. He is our butterfly boy, epidermolysis bullosa, a whole host of treatments coming out, both in terms of actual, treatments for the symptoms of the disease, but also hopefully some gene therapies that are coming out. In both cases, we're seeing really therapies that are coming in the pipelines. The challenge is, in our system, it may be significant delay in getting access for patients who could benefit from them as soon as they're available. And we need to make sure the system's in place to do that. So what we want to say is that we want a rare drug strategy that's going to treat all of those who are at risk for being left behind. And I just put a list of where we've got significant problems today where the therapies come in. Takes a long time to get the approval for the therapy, not necessarily just from the regulatory, but from the health technology, the cost effectiveness reviewers from the system that's going to negotiate the pricing, even from the private drug plans who will sit on the therapy until they've gotten, sometimes until the public system has actually acknowledged them, until they've been able to negotiate a better pricing with the company. And again, these are many patients then during that period of time that become progressively worse. They're not able then to actually recover what symptom functions that would have been even delayed during that period of time. So what we want to do is to make sure we're able to, as I say, at risk for being left behind. And in many cases where we've got new therapies coming in, where there may in fact be clinical trials that are still highly uncertain in terms of how well they will work for the entire patient population over a long period of time, this is where we want to make sure that we're able to intervene with strategies that would make them available to the patients on a managed basis. So here's what we're recommending, a 12-step plan. One is patient empowerment. Make sure the patient organizations are fully engaged. We've been really very much part of the whole research and development community and the clinical care community, but we need to be sure that we're part of this rare disease strategy, that we can create a standalone agency that's going to be independent and transparent, that's going to take all of the functions of that rare disease system, a bit like the Canadian Blood Services, Hema-Quebec, in terms of their responsibilities for all of the blood collected transfusions, but also for all of the treatments for the rare blood disorders. It's worked brilliantly. It's made sure that patients have gotten access to therapies in a timely fashion, in a monitored fashion, and also making sure that patients then are fully recognized in terms of the nuances of the diseases. And this is really important where the diseases may be highly variable. That we create incentives for research and development. Canada does not really, pull its weight in terms of its investment in terms of research and development for new therapies, especially new drug therapies. And we need to build that. We're just starting to build that capacity. We were happy to see some of the allocations, in the budget, but still far below what would have been, I think, the right, what is necessary in terms of an international basis, what other countries are doing. Speed up the access to treatments. I think I talked about that earlier, but also then making sure that we've got early access programs. Again, Canada, unlike Europe, unlike the US, does not really have a program for early access once the drugs are approved, but they have not yet been reimbursed. This is sometimes can be a couple of years when we have that gap where patients don't get access. We need to address the regulatory barriers. One of the big challenges we have now with the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board and their new guidelines, which are putting a real chill in terms of new drugs coming into Canada. Our research has shown that, Canada sits, sometimes 2-3 years slower than the US, than the EU in terms of bringing in new therapies. And in many cases, taking, as we say, somewhere between 2, 4, and 6 years in order to get those drugs into a formulary. This is, in fact, something that has to be improved. We've got to make sure that the regulatory approvals process that remains updated. These new therapies that come in are quite complex. They're highly challenging. Many of them will be gene therapies. And this is, in fact, very, very challenging, if, in fact, our approval process is not harmonized with other countries, if we're not specifically focusing on these therapies. We want to have pathways for special access. As we say, special access program does exist, but we need to also have programs for early access. So once these therapies are acknowledged and are able to come to the market, that we're able to make them available to patients as soon as possible. A need for multiple funding options. And again, depending on the population size, disease severity, we need to be able to anticipate that and figure out how we're going to fund these drugs way ahead of the time in terms of before they come, that we're not negotiating that. Managed access programs, hugely important, especially as we say, where you've got varied populations drugs that have high degrees of uncertainty based on their clinical trials, where we don't have long-term evidence, but we have enough evidence to really sense that they are going to be promising, and that certainly for some of the patient populations are going to be highly beneficial, but we're not as sure in terms of the whole population. Can we set up these managed access programs where the drug is made available ahead of time, but we're going to continue to collect the evidence? We already do this. Many countries do this. We just don't have it systematized. We need to facilitate that concurrent Health Canada and health technology assessment reviews. This is happening more and more, so that instead of having 8 to 10 months where Health Canada reviews, and then another 8 to 10 months where the health technology assessment agencies review, and then another year or so where the prices are negotiated, Can we not start that process concurrently rather than sequentially and actually take years off the time in terms of getting access for therapies, especially where there's high unmet need? Support real-world evidence generation. This is becoming more and more important. Having registries, having clinics, having the ability to be able to track the outcomes of treatment and other kinds of therapeutic interventions, quite frankly, using real-world evidence, analyzing that evidence, being able then to update both the treatment guidelines, but also updating the assessment. This is becoming, again, much more important in all jurisdictions, and certainly is happening, but not happening in Canada nearly as well as it needs to be, and certainly not a system in place in anticipation of therapies to come. And then networking clinical centers of expertise. We're really thrilled in the rare diseases community that many of these communities are already networked. Certainly the clinicians are, certainly many of the researchers are, but not necessarily officially linked in terms of sharing data, sharing research, and certainly sharing the ability to treat patients who may in fact be in much more outlying areas. So creating that official network centers of excellence. And again, really what we see in Europe in the European reference networks. So that is in fact our proposals, 12 steps, which we say could in fact be started today, tomorrow. They don't have to wait until 2022 to put many of these in place. Really hoping that everybody, healthcare professionals, researchers, patient community, certainly industry policymakers will come together and really endorse this rare disease drug strategy, work collaborative toward it. It's a huge opportunity for us in the rare disease community. I'm often asked, as and I also sit as chair of Rare Diseases International, which is our international alliance of organizations for rare disorders, like which country has the best drug program for rare diseases? And I always say there isn't a single country that is it. But if we do this right, we actually can be that country. Canada can in fact have the very best access to rare disease therapies in a way that's going to be measured, it's going to be monitored, and it's going to be absolutely affordable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wong-Rieger, not only for your advocacy, but as well as reviewing the 2022 Rare Drug Strategy, the $1 billion plus funding that's going to be unfolding, the 12-step plan, and with reference to scleroderma, including many other diseases that are underappreciated and undermanaged, as well as your call for access not only of drugs, but for an entire program of care, which calls for individualized and treatment, as well as timely diagnosis and helping to develop centers for clinical expertise, ultimately trying to leave no one behind. Thank you, Dr. Wong-Rieger.